Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the MeiZi Wash Processed China from BlendIn Coffee Club. And there's this bag right there. And BlendIn, based out of Sugar Land, Texas, and they were a suggestion to us by both Ed Tokaji and Stephen Neville. So shout outs to and thank you to Ed and Stephen for the suggestion. But diving a little further into the comments, I found one from about a year ago in which Colin Richards suggested that we try this coffee in the double natural form. So that's actually my mistake, as I had completely forgotten that he had suggested that specific coffee to us. But with that being said, from this point going forward, we're going to do our best to review one washed and one non-wash processed coffee from every coffee roaster that is suggested to us. That way it kind of gives us a better overall picture of the coffee roaster as a whole. And that's exactly what we did with all three of those coffee roasters that were featured in that blind taste test rankings video. And while we're on the note of that blind taste test rankings video, this coffee did finish 6th place out of 7 coffees on that day, and we'll discuss why that was a little later into this video. But when it comes to kind of picking which coffees we were going to be picking from BlendIn, I wanted to say that it was that natural processed Bolivian Batian that caught my interest the most by far, and it's the coffee I wanted to try the most. So as a result, we were always going to pick a wash processed coffee to kind of counteract that. And given that we had never reviewed a Chinese coffee, it was a perfect opportunity given that they did have a wash processed Chinese coffee. Even if that natural did sound a little bit more like our flavor profile, going back, if I'd remember that comment, though, we would have gone with the natural and then picked a different wash processed coffee. But yeah, it happens. Looking forward to discussing this coffee nonetheless. This right here is day 16 of this coffee. And I didn't find a recipe for BlendIn on their website, so the recipe we went with was a 16.671 water to coffee ratio brewed at 197 degrees Fahrenheit. Like this coffee best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. And I'm not sure I ever got a great indication of the roast profile for BlendIn as a whole between these two coffees, but for this one specifically, it definitely was on the more developed side, so I would call it a shade under an American medium for the roast profile. And with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. So day 7, which was that blind taste test rankings day, and could initially say that it was pretty muted as a whole, but if you watched that video, then you saw that we were able to pick this coffee out because objectively, in terms of quality, it just felt like the green wasn't up to standard as the other cups of coffee on that table. And there was a great comment from Colin Richards in that blind taste test video where he did mention that this variety is actually a hybrid between an Arabica and a Robusta bean, and that will play a lot into this review later in this video. But as a result, yeah, it didn't cool down particularly well, and I was just kind of able to pick out this coffee from the other ones because it just didn't necessarily feel like the same standard as the other coffees on that table. Day 8, coffee does have a slight burnt popcorn aroma in the brew, and when you're grounding the coffee, it does have a very kind of distinct nuttiness to it, and that really does help kind of with this coffee in general. But it was pretty delicate and tame post-brew as well. There are very slight red fruits complementing what is a pretty slight base in general. The vanilla note felt very apt on that day. I think when I really think about the vanilla note, I can kind of pick that out. But for the most part, the coffee just kind of feels, well, pretty smoky in general. Day 9, still not seeing too much of an improvement from this cup of coffee as it's still coming out, well, a bit ashy in the automatic coffee maker. Feels better as it has cooled down, but it still does have a fair bit of the smokiness, and the smokiness was pretty consistent throughout the time drinking this coffee. There's a slight bit, very slight bit of red fruit sweetness, but not too much that would really separate itself from a lot of other aspects of this coffee. Day 11 was finding subtle improvements at the lower temperatures, and that's why I really liked the lower temperatures for this coffee, was because I was able to get out a nice bit more sweetness. I think I was just able to pick out the sweetness better at the lower temperatures because you weren't getting as much of the smokiness. My primary objective was to kind of dial back that smokiness since it was very smoky right from the onset. And as a result, I was able to pick out this kind of caramelized burnt sugar taste to it, leaving it the sweetest it had been to that point. I say with more developed coffees, the best thing I can always hope for and expect from them is a caramelized taste. It just depends on what specific way we're going with that caramelized, but if it's caramelized burnt sugar, caramelized popcorn, caramelized whatever the caramelized flavor you can get from it, caramelized chocolate, that's a common one too. That's the best thing I can get from more developed coffees. Day 13, coffee feels the most robust when it's been brewed through the V60. The V60 was my least favorite brew method for this coffee, as the lower temperatures did help tame a little bit of the smokiness, but at the same time, it was probably the most kind of smoky burnt sugar out of any of the brew methods. As a result, there's a slight bit of spice to the cup of coffee and a bit of nuttiness as well. I feel like for the most part, this coffee is a little forgettable for the additional aspects of the cup of coffee because you're just so focused on the kind of heavy smokiness that you are experiencing, especially in the finish for this coffee. Day 14, better brewed through the automatic coffee maker than with the V60, as the cup in general just seems to have improved overall. Most distinct and pronounced factor is again the slight burnt sugar taste, and there's a hidden herbality to it. Cup of coffee feels like it's slightly improving. This one's brewed through the Chemex, and I'd say that it's the best cup of coffee it's been to this point here on day 16. I think it's been consistent. I think the only kind of changes that have really been made is maybe a little bit of the smokiness kind of tapering off. And in addition to that, the lowering of the temperatures really did seem to help the cup of coffee as a whole. But for the most part, yeah, it's been pretty consistent. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And 2 level 4s, and they're going to be really unsurprising, so let's run through those real quick. The finish and the smokiness. So I've been harping on the smokiness a lot. Very prominent in this cup of coffee, and it does have a pretty, well, smoky, lasting finish to it in general. Now here's what I wanted to say, especially when I found out that this is kind of a hybrid Arabica Robusta coffee. This is kind of weird to say, but I feel like Robusta actually has a taste, and it's what people associate the taste of coffee with. So if it would be kind of weird to put maybe a coffee flavor note on a coffee or a Robusta flavor note on a coffee, I feel like that makes more sense, because anytime I drink something that is Robusta, it tastes like what people associate coffee tasting like. That's my opinion anyway. But yeah, that's that kind of smoky finish that I'm getting from this cup of coffee. Quite a few level 3s. Let's run through those real quick. Cleanliness level 3. Body level 3, yeah, both of those. I feel like they're perfect on that. Savoriness, it does have a little bit of savoriness to it. Kind of mentioned a little bit of herbality to it as well. And then the bitterness at a level 3. My primary objective was to kind of tone down both the smokiness and the bitterness. So I think getting into that level 3 mark was a success for me anyway. And I think the Chemex really did cut down on both of those things, especially with the lower temperatures. What's interesting enough is that BlendIn does have a kind of tasting wheel on the back of their bags too, so you can probably see it right there. And I disagree with a fair bit of it. They have the body at a level 5. When brewed through the other brew methods, yeah, it's definitely heavier bodied, so I can kind of agree with that. I don't know if I'd go all the way up to a level 5. The sweetness they have really high. I can't agree with that. As you see, we have the sweetness charted at a level 2 here, and that was through a lot of work to get the sweetness as high as it was. I contemplated being really generous and putting it on the lower side of the level 3, but we'll go with level 2. The caramelized sweetness that was coming from it, that's the highest I could place it. The bitterness they have pretty low. I can't agree with that. The acidity they have low. I definitely agree with that. I mean, it's kind of a more developed coffee, so you'd expect it to be lower on the acidity as a whole. For the most part, it seems like there's kind of contrasting opinions to this, and I'm not entirely sure maybe how they came up with their own sort of tasting wheel to it, but this is the way I came up with the tasting wheel based off of the way we brewed it and my own impressions of this coffee. So agree to disagree on that, but for the most part, I like the way that this tasting wheel looks. It does look like the way you would expect a tasting wheel to look for some sort of like more developed Central American coffee as a whole, as I feel like that's kind of the best descriptor I had for this cup of coffee as a whole. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I feel like I've kind of been downplaying the fact that this coffee wasn't necessarily as bad as that first impression kind of left it. It does taste like Robusta to me, in my opinion anyway, but I've never necessarily said that mediums are like really bad, and I'm not even saying that this is necessarily like a true medium. There's some really nice components to this cup of coffee, and I mentioned that I was able to get some kind of caramelized sweetness from it, and that was the best aspect of this coffee, and dialing back a lot of those really strong smoky and like earthy flavors was a nice little additional factor to this cup of coffee. There's some positives to this. So that's what I really want to say about this cup of coffee, is it's not going to be my first choice, and that's why it finished 6th, and it still was my 6th favorite out of those 7 coffees that we did put in that blind taste test video. But with that being said, there are nice components to this cup of coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I feel like if you actually do like Robusta and are curious about maybe something of a different origin, then this is a pretty nice fit for you. Keep in mind, yeah, definitely more developed, more smoky, a little bit more just roasty in general, has a lot of those kind of heavier characteristics to it, heavier bodied cup of coffee in general, then this would probably be a pretty good fit for you. I think that's kind of the best way I can direct somebody towards this coffee, and I feel like this is the best way I could review this coffee in general. But if you by chance had an opportunity to try this, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it, as well as I've already gotten a fair bit of feedback about this coffee, and it's not necessarily the most positive feedback, as the Double Natural seems to be a fan favorite of people. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the MeiZi wash processed China from BlendIn Coffee Club. Thank you for watching.